Hello everybody, it's Harry here. In this video series we're going to go through the full implementation and exploit lots of awesome features available in .NET. We're going to cover like really good DDD and clean architecture practices. I'm going to show you how to do test-driven development the whole way to get 100% unit test coverage from the start. And we're going to look through a bunch of awesome features you can read in the list, including minimal API, JWT token, Docker Compose, caching, API versioning, distributed telemetry, and all this kind of thing. And finally, I'm going to show you how to use Terraform to set up AWS infrastructure and Kubernetes and GitHub Actions for your CI/CD. So yeah, these are going to be around 10-minute videos, so short content, easy to consume, and all the source code is going to be available. Let's enjoy. Zooming in, DDD stands for Domain Driven Design. It's a software design approach that allows us to tackle complexity in our software, and we'll be learning how to implement this design pattern in this course. Okay, cool. So to start off with, especially since we're going to be doing TDD, we need a really good plan, and we don't want to tie ourselves into a knot and write a bunch of tests for code which isn't really going to fulfill our purposes. So what we're building is a currency converter API. The idea is not to really make like an amazingly useful tool. It's just about displaying features available. And so currency converter API is a way to go here. And what we're going to do is have an objective, develop scalable high performance currency conversion API. We're going to build 3 endpoints for latest currency conversion, and also getting historical exchange rates. In terms of architecture and design, it needs to have performance and resilience like caching, recharge policy, and circuit breaker. We're going to implement like good code quality with things like solid principle and domain driven design and dependency injection. We're going to have cover security, logging, and monitoring. We're going to give 100% test coverage, and we're going to show you how we can deploy this in a scalable way. So it's important to have your requirements laid out before you, even though you can always be creative and invent new things too. Okay, cool. So let's jump into it. For planning, we're going to use something called UML class diagrams. And I'm using a really cool website called Miro.co, which is free to use for your planning. And I've already started off. We're going to be building out our domain objects here, which will all be value objects for now. Perhaps in the future, we'll enhance this to have like a richer domain and aggregates around currencies for our users. For now, we can fulfill the full spec by just using value object. The next thing I'm going to plan here is going to be called something called the currency snapshot, and I'm going to define the properties that this has. So it's going to have a date time, and it's going to have a date captured, and it's going to have a list of money. It's going to have a list of money, so that'll be all the exchange rates for the currency, and of course it needs its own currency code, and we can call that code, and then define what behavior your value object should have. One thing I wanted to have is a starter create method, and that will take in your currency code, and it will take in an array of something like money. I'm not 100% sure at this stage, and that will be to like give it its various exchange rates that it needs. So this we could call exchange rates. And then the other thing it needs to be able to do according to our spec is convert. So you're going to tell it what you want to convert to, and you're going to tell it like an amount. So you could say how much would 20 US be in South African rand, or whatever it could be. So let's ask for the amount. Cool. And then the other important thing we need here is like an interface to make this functional. So whoa, okay, let's try and copy out one of these. We'll call this, according to our spec, we have to do a few things. So we need an exchange provider, and we need to be able to search. So let's get a list of currency snapshots, and that should be a paginated search. So let's call it search async. Do is you can give it the code you want, currency code, and you need to give it a date time start date and a date time end date. And then the other thing we need to do is find latest. So currency snapshot find latest async, and then this would be pretty easy. You're just gonna give it a currency code like that. Further, to make that plug in and work correctly, we need like a factory method, because we said we want this to be extendable and be able to support multiple different kinds of exchange providers down the time. So let's create an exchange provider factory, and that would say exchange provider, and it would be get provider, and we need some kind of a type. So we could put exchange provider type. So then we need the type. So I think we should also give exchange provider type and get type as something that everything needs. And an exchange provider type would be, we can use like an enum to represent that like this, not like that. Okay, exchange provider type. We did say that we were going to use the Frankfurter API, so let's make one of the types a Frankfurter type. That's like a start for the domain. Let's jump into the rest of it and go through what it looks like and fast forward. Okay, cool. So as for our basic application layer, we're going to be using these three handlers, and it's pretty simple. We're going to have these queries and these response models. Next, let's plan out some of our infrastructure layer. Okay, cool. So like the infrastructure is pretty simple because we're just gonna implement the two domain interfaces that are required, and then there'll be like a HTTP thing going on in the middle here. So we're gonna need to expect some HTTP results which get mapped to the domain layer here. So that's the approach we're taking. We're gonna get some kind of a JSON response here which we need to map. Let's think about some of the additional little things we're gonna need to fulfill the requirements. Okay, so we're gonna need like a cache service where you can set and get whatever you might want to use, so that we don't have to keep on hitting the Frankfurter API again and again, so our application layer can use our Redis cache where we'll implement this in the cache service. Let's think about some other stuff we might need. Okay, we're going to need a time provider to make unit testing because we're going to build unit tests and integration tests. So for those, we're going to need like to inject a time provider that we can mock. Essentially, we'll use dependency injection to inject the time provider and use that to get the date now instead of like the system datetime now. Okay, so we're also going to use the result pattern for error handling. So I'm also putting these little records into my domain layer to be shared across the application, and we're going to essentially have to wrap every single response in a result so we know if it succeeded or failed, and eventually this will carry through to our APIs where we'll be able to return like success or error responses on our APIs. Okay, that pretty much wraps up some of our planning here. We will be injecting certain like middleware into the app as well, but this gives a good way to just get an overview of the project before we jump into TDD. In animation, you have something called straight ahead animation where you just animate each frame by frame and it kind of morphs without like an overall plan of where each frame in the scene should be. So if we were to just go ahead and do TDD without having any idea, you could end up with something really funny and tie yourself into knots. So it's important, like with anything, to do your proper planning so that you get like a very defined structure in the end. Other planning I've already put out here for the CI/CD we're going to get into later. We're going to set up a CI/CD for this pull request flow where you'll have user branch, QA branch, staging branch, and production branch. That will trigger a workflow, run the unit test, and deploy the code to our EKS clusters. We can see that planned out over here. And then what I've also done is where we're going to use Terraform to set up our infrastructure. Very simple idea for now. We're just going to have an EKS cluster and we're going to be running our currency converter API in there. We're going to have a Redis cache in there, and it's going to be talking to the Frankfurter API externally, and clients who are authorized will be able to make authenticated requests. That's it for now. Let's jump into the project structure. Okay, cool. So jumping into Visual Studio, we're going to start off with a blank solution, and we are going to call this currency converter. And to start off with, we're going to create our two folders. One will be called source and the next one will be called tests. Let's go ahead and add our project. Going to be creating the X unit test project, and over here in the SRC, let's go ahead and add the rest of our stuff. Going to be creating class libraries for the domain layer, application layer, and infrastructure layer. Go ahead and add our integration test project, and now let's go ahead and add the presentation layer. And for this, we're going to say we do want to enable container support. We do not want to use controllers, and this all looks fine to me. Okay, cool. So now integration test is only going to need that presentation layer. Do that. Unit tests is going to need all the layers for presentation, as far as I'm aware. Presentation will use all of the layers. Infrastructure we can say we'll use application and domain, and application will use domain, and domain will not use anything. So that gives us the overall clean architecture and a good base to start with our TDD. So next video, we're going to jump into TDD, what it is, how to do it. So let's go.